What if I told you that the US dollar, the most powerful currency in the world, isn't backed by gold, but by oil, and a secret deal made in a desert 50 years ago? A deal so powerful, it let America print money, fight wars, and run the world, all without going broke. But now, that system is starting to crack. So here's the real question: what happens when the world no longer needs the dollar, or the oil behind it? Stay with me till the end. This story will change how you see the dollar forever. In the early 1970s, the United States, the world's most powerful economy, was facing a perfect storm. Gas stations ran dry. Cars stretched in endless lines for miles, desperate for a few gallons of fuel. Schools reduced hours to save energy. Factories slowed, lights flickered, and across the nation, a sense of crisis hung heavy in the air. Oil prices were surging. Inflation was accelerating. And the US dollar, once the cornerstone of global finance, was rapidly losing value. This wasn't just a temporary slump or a bit of bad luck. This was the unraveling of a financial order that had held since World War II, and the consequences would reshape the global economy for generations. To understand what went wrong, we have to go back to 1944, to a small town in New Hampshire, where delegates from 44 allied nations met to design the post-war financial system. The result was the Bretton Woods Agreement, a system where the US dollar was directly backed by gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. This made the dollar the world's reserve currency, trusted, stable, and backed by real gold stored in places like Fort Knox. Every $35 was equivalent to an ounce of gold. But by the 1960s, the US began to stretch this system to its limits. To fund the costly Vietnam War and President Lyndon B. Johnson's massive domestic welfare programs, known as the Great Society, the US started printing more money without increasing its gold reserves. Foreign nations noticed. Countries like France and West Germany began redeeming their dollars for gold, draining US reserves by the ton. Shipments of bullion quietly left American vaults and crossed the Atlantic. By 1971, America's gold reserves were rapidly depleting. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and made a stunning announcement. "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." With that, the dollar was no longer tied to anything tangible. The gold standard was over. Overnight, the world's most important currency became a fiat currency, backed not by gold, but only by trust. The immediate result was chaos. Without gold as an anchor, the Federal Reserve was free to print as much money as it wanted. Inflation took off. Imports became more expensive. American wages couldn't keep up. And confidence in the dollar began to erode. By 1973, inflation was climbing fast. The cost of living surged. People's savings have lost value. Businesses hesitated. The economy began to feel unstable, unmoored from reality. And then came the moment that would push the country into a full-blown crisis. In October 1973, the world watched in shock as a new war broke out in the Middle East. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel, hoping to reclaim lands lost during the Six-Day War of 1967. It was a bold move. One driven by years of humiliation and unresolved territorial disputes. And it caught Israel, and much of the West, off guard. Within hours, the United States threw its weight behind Israel, delivering billions in emergency military aid, including tanks, fighter jets, and ammunition. This wasn't just about supporting an ally, it was about maintaining influence in a volatile, oil-rich region during the height of the Cold War. But that support came at a cost. In response, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, led by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Libya, and others, took unprecedented action. On October 17, 1973, they imposed an oil embargo on the United States and any nation that supported Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and Canada. This wasn't just a protest, it was a geopolitical earthquake. For the first time in modern history, oil was being used as a weapon of war. The effects were immediate and brutal. Oil prices didn't just rise, they exploded. In just a few short months, the price of a barrel surged from around $3 to nearly $12, a 400% increase. America, a country built on highways, suburban sprawl, and car culture, was blindsided. Gas stations across the country displayed signs. No gas today. Limit, 10 gallons. Closed due to fuel shortage. Lines stretched for blocks. Some drivers waited hours, only to find out the pump had run dry. Tensions rose. Fights broke out. In some cities, National Guardsmen were deployed to maintain order. To conserve energy, the federal government introduced drastic measures. Speed limits were cut to 55 miles per hour nationwide. Daylight saving time was extended. Businesses shortened operating hours. The crisis didn't just hit the gas tank, it slammed into the entire economy. Factories dependent on oil-based energy scaled back operations or shut down completely. Home heating oil became scarce as winter approached. Prices for everything, food, transportation, consumer goods, rose steeply. And yet, wages remained stagnant. This toxic combination gave rise to a term economists hadn't used before: stagflation, simultaneous inflation and economic stagnation. It defied the usual logic of supply and demand. And it hit the American middle class the hardest. Unemployment surged. Mortgage rates climbed into double digits. Savings lost value. Consumer confidence plummeted. Meanwhile, OPEC nations were raking in profits. Petrodollars, the revenues from oil, began flooding into the coffers of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iran. Suddenly, the economic center of gravity was shifting. For the first time, the United States was no longer in control of global energy prices, and that threatened not just its economy, but its entire position on the world stage. And in the background, America's Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union, the rising economies of Asia, and oil-producing powers, watched as the U.S. struggled to adapt. The era of cheap oil, and of uncontested American economic dominance, had come to a crashing halt. And Washington knew, if the dollar was going to survive, it needed a new foundation. Something as powerful as gold, maybe even more powerful. And so, a solution began to take shape, not in Washington, but far from the spotlight, in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. In 1974, just a year after the embargo, the U.S. quietly sent high-level officials, including Treasury Secretary William Simon, to negotiate with the one nation that could shift global oil flows, Saudi Arabia. Behind closed doors, an agreement was reached, one that would change the course of history. The terms were simple, but profoundly strategic. Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. would provide military protection and advanced weapons. Saudi oil profits would be reinvested into U.S. government bonds and American banks. Soon after, the rest of OPEC followed suit. The deal created something new, something bigger than gold: the petrodollar system. With this system in place, every country on Earth that needed oil, which was nearly all of them, suddenly also needed U.S. dollars to buy it. This created a permanent, global demand for dollars, even though they were no longer backed by gold. It was artificial, but brilliant. The U.S. could now run massive deficits without collapsing its currency. It could borrow endlessly, fund wars, stimulate the economy, and do it all while the world bought up American debt in the form of treasury bonds. Nations like Japan, Germany, and Saudi Arabia recycled their oil profits into U.S. assets. They lent America its own money, just to keep buying oil. This made the dollar not just dominant, but inescapable. With petrodollars flooding the financial system, a new age began. Wall Street exploded. Credit became a way of life. The financial sector grew bigger than manufacturing. The U.S. could fund wars without raising taxes, launch social programs without cutting spending, grow an economy based on debt, and get away with it. This also made the dollar the weapon of choice in economic warfare. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and global banking rules were all enforced in dollars, giving Washington immense power. But behind all this power was a price. To get dollars, poor countries had to borrow from U.S.-controlled institutions like the IMF and World Bank, often under crippling terms. If the dollar rose in value, their debts ballooned. In Latin America, Asia, and Africa, entire economies collapsed. Riots, recessions, and political upheavals followed. Meanwhile, the U.S. grew stronger. Its military expanded. Its banks dictated the rules of global finance. And when a country tried to step outside the system, the empire flexed its muscle. Iraq proposed selling oil in euros. Libya pushed for a gold-backed African currency. Both regimes fell. Coincidence? Some say yes. Many say no. But like all empires, even secret ones, the petrodollar system isn't immune to change. Today, that once solid foundation is beginning to erode. China is now buying oil from Saudi Arabia and paying in yuan. Russia sells to India in rupees, to China in rubles. Together with Brazil and South Africa, they form the BRICS alliance, an emerging bloc working to build an alternative to the dollar system. In 2023, BRICS announced plans for a new global trade currency, sparking what some now call the era of de-dollarization. If enough nations stop using the dollar for oil, its artificial demand will collapse, and along with it, the financial engine of American dominance. For 50 years, the petrodollar system propped up U.S. supremacy. It let the U.S. fund wars in the Middle East, stimulate its economy, and influence global politics, all without traditional financial limits. But today, energy is shifting. Alliances are evolving. And the dollar? No longer untouchable. The real question isn't if the petrodollar collapses. It's when. And when that day comes, what happens to America's superpower status? We built an empire on oil and paper. But oil is running out. And the paper? It's starting to burn. Subscribe for more untold stories, financial mysteries, and the hidden forces that shape our world. And let us know, what do you think happens when the dollar no longer rules the world?